All right. Welcome back, everybody. This is the Social Brain. We're episode 28 now. Really fun to keep doing this show. Today, we're talking about something that has been really, really fun to research, to really dive into. It's a topic that is going to hit everyone in a very personal way. This is something that we deal with in our every lives all the time. We're going to be talking about power dynamics. We're going to be talking about status and what these kind of things do to the brain, to your health, to all of these things. And so, for a minute, I just want you to really stop and reflect on how these dynamics play out in your daily life. Because from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep, you are constantly navigating a web of intricate power dynamics and status every single day. And it's in every single one of our relationships. It's in our personal relationships, whether that's romantic, whether that's family dynamics. It's in our professional relationships between managers and employees and all of the inner dynamics between employees and all of these things. It's everywhere, and it's almost a currency in our social life. It's really how we dictate the relationships and how the relationships unfold. And it's fascinating to see how this kind of unravels in terms of how our brain processes these things. uh, but one of the things that I really want to challenge you on is that I think a lot of people have this negative connotation when they hear the word power. It's like it sounds like visceral, like like power. I don't want to use power. And that's great because there's this cultural kind of idea around power that it's all about dominance, that it's all about aggression, that it's about controlling people against their will, and all of these kind of things. And that is absolutely a part of it. There are ways of using power that are very forceful, that are very aggressive and dominant. But you have to remember that power is also at play in all of the cooperative action that we take as a species. It's really what allows us to be the most successful and dominant species on the face of the earth. It's what allows us to engage in altruistic and cooperative behavior, to form really strong bonds and cohesive groups. It's that attractive power within our kind of social groups, all of these things that are fascinating, that hold everything together. But so much of this really kind of goes unnoticed because it's operating in the background. And something that we'll talk a lot about throughout this episode is the fact that this is pervasive across the animal kingdom, across so many social species, all the way down to fish. And so this is something that our brain has evolved and adapted to track, to understand, to bias our behavior and all of these things. And so often it's running in the background. It's something that we don't consciously think about all of the time, but it's massively influencing our behavior. And so we want to kind of set the stage first and talk about like what power actually is, the differences between something like power and dominance or power and status, but then get into some of these health effects, what like low status versus high status does to our health, does to our cardiovascular system, all of these things that we've seen in other monkeys, other animals, but also look at how it manifests in the people at the top of the hierarchy, how these hierarchies form. And then at the end, it's really interesting at the end. We'll get into some of the nuance because there's lots of different kinds of power. And depending on which kind of power you use is very much going to dictate the kind of reaction you get from the people that power is being used on. So this is a fascinating one. I'm like absolutely excited about it. I hope that we can get to all of it in an hour. If we don't, we might like save some for a future episode. But I'm Taylor Guthrie. I run the channel The Cellular Republic. I have college courses on all of this stuff. And this is my awesome co-host, Andrew Cooper Sansone, runs the channel Sense of Mind. And I'm going to kick it over to him.
Yeah. So as we're talking today, if you guys get anything out of this episode, please consider liking and subscribing to our channels. That really helps us to keep this going and keep this free to everyone watching. And if you want to support us a little more tangibly, you can check out our Patreon. And I'll just throw up the QR code there, but it's patreon.com/the social brain. And you can subscribe for as little as $1 a month and just support us, keep this going. If you get any kind of value out of this, this is a really great way to kind of show your support. But like I said, just liking and subscribing would be awesome, and really just interacting in the chat. We're already seeing some activity there right now. We'd love to address questions the best we can. And so, yeah, I'll hand it back over to Taylor to get back into today's topic, which is power and status.
Yeah. And thanks to Philip for these awesome comments that we have in the chat right now about reading about status, the role it plays in culture. It's prevalent in everything, every single interaction, every conversation. Right now, there's a power dynamic at play just with people listening to us. It's fascinating, and so I think it's really important to start with what power actually is. Like, let's try to come up with a definition. Do you have some kind of Webster definition you want to throw out, Andrew?
I was looking at the APA, the American Psychological definition of or American Psychological Association definition of power, and I'll pull that up. It's really simple. They just define it as the capacity to influence others even when they try to resist this influence. Excuse me. So
And that can sound
yeah,
really devious, right?
yeah.
It can. But I think a really important thing to think about. There's a quote from Bertrand Russell, and it's I'm pulling it up. I thought I had it up already. It's really about how the fundamental concept in social science is power, in the same sense in which energy is the fundamental concept in physics. And so, like, yes, power is something that can influence someone to do something that they otherwise wouldn't do. But you have to think that, like, so much of this is really what builds societies. Like, a lot of this is referent, right? It's that I really want to be a part of this group. I want this person to like me. I want this this relationship to endure and to last, and all of these things. All of those things are like motivating forms of power that may, I might put more time into my relationship, into my marriage, into the group that I'm a part of, the leisure group that I'm a part of, not because it's serving some type of like selfish need that I have, but because I want to contribute to those things, because there's some sort of like attractive power that those things have over me. So it's not always necessarily like this bad thing. And I think that's really what we want to challenge through a lot of this, is trying to remove some of the negative connotation that comes up, these visceral feelings that come up when you think about it.
Yeah, because there's a difference between cooperative power dynamics and coercive or violent violent power. And I think that's really something that gets lost in some of these discussions, like Taylor's talking about. It's it's not always that, in that definition that it says the capacity to influence others even when they try to resist this influence. It's not always that the capacity to do so involves violence or force or coercion. So it's really important to keep that in mind. It's this ability to influence even when there's some resistance. So maybe we should dive into that a little deeper and talk about the distinction between power and dominance, and what is dominance in your view?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that is really conflated. When you think about power, oftentimes you think of this kind of like toxic cultural concept of like the alpha male that has really taken off in a way that it never was intended to. Like when you look at Franz de Waal, that does a lot of the primatology research. He wrote a whole book on like primate politics and all of these things that really kind of kicked off a lot of the like the alpha male, like I'm just gonna dominate and be aggressive and do all of these things. That definitely is a way that you can assert your will. And as we'll kind of talk about, a lot of the dominant stuff is something that that we as humans, like lower primates and all of these things, will immediately attend to those kind of things, because there's threat associated with that. We look for large body size, we look for whether someone can overpower us, all of these kind of things. But you have to think about long-term dynamics, because we're a social species that maintains really long lasting relationships. And so if you're constantly oppressing someone, if you're dominating them, if you're treating them like they're less than you and you're objectifying them, they are not going to want to maintain that relationship. And when you hear Franz de Waal talk about like alpha males, he's like, alpha males are not bullies. Alpha males have allies. Alpha males are the ones that, like, you can have an alpha male that's one of the smallest chimps in the troop, but because he's formed a coalition, because he's formed these reciprocal relationships with others, he's developed a different kind of power that doesn't require dominance. And there are moments when dominance is needed, and he can maybe send one of his allies that's this really like big chimp that can do that for him, but it's not necessary. It's not what power is.
Right. Yeah, and it's good to think about that if it's if power is being exercised in a way that as you described, somebody is feeling like less than that they're constantly being told that they're not important and things like that, that the only way that can be maintained is usually through coercion. So it's an interesting dynamic there, but I guess I digress a little bit. We're talking about the difference between dominance and power, and then there's also this related concept of status, right? And a lot of these studies on power, especially in psychology and neuroscience, put kind of mush power and status together a little bit, or they end up sort of looking at both because they overlap
A
conceptually.
lot.
So yeah, what is the difference between power and status?
There's a lot of high correlations between power and status. People that have a lot of power tend to rise higher in status. This interesting question in the chat: why do you two think discussing status is somewhat taboo in society? That kind of plays into a lot of what we're trying to talk about and what we're trying to kind of fight against, because the word power oftentimes implicates you in thinking that like we're trying to take away your personal power, that we're trying to take away your agency in some way. And I think that that's something that our culture is very much trying to fight against right now, right? We're trying to say that like we want to prop people up, we want everybody to be a free agent, to be independent, to not have to be told what to do, all of that kind of stuff. So I think it gets a little iffy talking about it, because status itself is implying that people that are higher status have more ability to exert their will. They have more resources. They have more information. They have more kind of referent qualities in terms of they might be more attractive. They might be all of these different kinds of things. But one of the things about status that's really important to think about and remember is that you can be low status. So think about like socioeconomic status, right? You don't have a lot of money. You don't have a lot of influence in terms of getting people to do what you want, but you may have a lot of prestige. Like think about college professors, right? College professors have a lot of expert power. They can talk about the things that they know, and they can influence people in terms of having more knowledge than someone, having more information than someone, but they aren't high in status because they don't have the resources to influence people in that way.
What do you think would be an example of the opposite, like someone with high status but low power, or
Yeah.
high power but low status? Actually, or no,
Well,
that's
that
what you
was
just described. Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
sorry.
yeah. So no, the other side. So you can have someone that's considered being high in socioeconomic status, but lives their entire life at the will of other people, right? And this is something I like to challenge a lot of people. I mean, this comes into all kinds of different philosophies throughout the years and all of this. That there's been a lot of time spent trying to understand what it is we're doing for ourselves and what it is that we're doing because of the expectations of others. And that's where a lot of these power dynamics come in. So you can have someone that's really high in socioeconomic status and status in general, but all of their behaviors are dictated by the expectations of other people. They're constantly doing
Mm,
something for their boss, they're constantly doing something for their spouse. They're never doing something out of their own kind of creative spirit, their own like self-will.
that's really interesting. There's this novel by Ayn Rand, who's a very controversial figure, but The Fountainhead, and it's most of the characters in that book fall into that, where they might be really high status, but everything they do is just dictated by the social milieu that they find themselves in, except for the main character. I don't want to give any spoilers, but it's just an interesting literary example of that. But then we have another interesting question in the chat. A terrorist can influence actions through threats. Does that mean that terrorist has status in the form of dominance?
Form of dominance, yeah.
Form of, yes. I was like,
Yeah. that ties into what we're talking about, right? Because we're really trying to disentangle these concepts that often get conflated with one another. Dominance is not power. Status is not power, right? This person is using a form of power through coercive means, right? They're coercing through threat, through violence, and that is causing people to do what it is that they want them to do. But that doesn't mean that they have like high status, which might be dictated by prestige. So they might have status within their terrorist organization. They might have high socioeconomic status. So they might have a lot of means and resources to do the things that they want. But we're really trying to disentangle how these concepts are related to one another. Because if we just think of power in terms of status or in terms of dominance, then we're missing so much of the nuance of our everyday life, right? Because oftentimes when we think about power, we immediately jump to these like high forms of power, to these cultural forms of power, like a judge or a police officer, a terrorist, right? But we are dealing with power dynamics every single time we have a conversation with someone. Every single time we're trying to get more recognition or appreciation from a loved one. That's all about power. And it's not the same kind of power, right? It's about recognition. It's about wanting to be a part of something. And that's causing you to do something that you otherwise probably wouldn't have done if it was just you in that situation.
That's really interesting. And maybe we could spell out like an example of sort of everyday life, getting away from those really high forms of power and just talking about how it is in everyday conversations that power dynamics come into play. It seems like a lot of it has to do with recognizing someone else's, greater ability to do something, whether it's just, leading a team, like understanding those dynamics, or if it's, in thinking like of sports or something like that, where somebody who's performing better, who's like the better player, is, probably given more power on the team, and it's not has nothing to do with coercion or force, and it just naturally arises because of people's perception and understanding of other people's capacities.
We automatically infer competence when we interact with someone. We are like there's all of these models. We've talked about this before in our like in group out group episode that we did in terms of like how we judge other people, and we're constantly judging people on how skilled they are in whatever they're trying to do, right? So like Andrew talked about like sports teams. So who's the best player on the team and who's the worst player on the team? We're constantly engaged in these social comparative processes of trying to figure out where we fit in the competence ladder, right? Where do our skills fit among all of these other people that we're a part of? Because you have to remember that power itself is a group process. Power is not something that you can just have in n of one person, right? uh, the whole point of it, and this kind of leads into our next topic in terms of hierarchies in general. Hierarchies are super prevalent through the entire animal kingdom. Every single animal, I probably shouldn't say every single, probably most of the social animals, all the way down to fish. There's like different fish, there's different reptiles, tons of different mammals. Anything that has to engage in social cooperative behavior spontaneously forms status hierarchies. And it's something that happens immediately. It's something that happens really quickly. This is something that we see with young children. You put like 3 and 4-year-olds together, they will immediately arrange themselves within a pecking order, within a status order, based on warmth, based on competence, based on like where they fit among their peers and how good they are at something and how much they know about something. And these things we have to remember, because they're so prevalent in all of these different animal species, they're highly conserved across evolution. And there's something that our brain is engaging in unconsciously without us even thinking about it.
Yeah, that's that's so interesting. And you mentioned the term pecking order, and maybe since we're talking about kind of the evolutionary angle to this, we could talk about where that term pecking order comes from. That's something I
Mhm.
actually learned from one of your lectures.
No, go for it. Yeah, take it away.
Well, I think it comes does it come from a specific species of bird, or is it just
It's
birds
hens.
in general. Hens. Okay, so
Mhm.
chickens, hens. They establish this kind of, I guess it's a dominance hierarchy, right?
Mhm.
And it's basically like the hens that are higher in the hierarchy are will peck the ones that are lower in the hierarchy, and that's kind of a form of showing their higher status in some way.
Yeah. And the really cool thing about it too is that we also need to forget about like male female type stuff with all of this too. That this is not a male thing. Like yes, there's lots of psychology studies that have shown that like that men in general are more prone to seek power. And it's hard to interpret those results, right? Because we don't really know whether that's culturally influenced or not, right? Because our culture very much like pushed a male kind of narrative around they should be part of the workforce, they should be managing people, they should be doing all of these things. So we kind of
Well,
gravitate to that.
yeah, and
Yeah, go ahead.
historically, we're talking about these, the intermingling of power and dominance and status, and it's just men do biologically have uh, larger frames and stronger uh, bodies and things like that. So especially through history, before we've gotten to sort of modern times and more modern liberal civilizations, we relied more on that force to establish those power hierarchies. So it seems like sort of a natural outcome that men would end up at the top of those, as unjust as that may be. That historical influence almost certainly has to have some influence on the present.
But pecking order is about a female species.
Right,
Like
right.
the
Yeah, yeah,
term
yeah.
itself came from female chickens, right? And when you look at primates, when you look at all of these different monkey species and everything, there's social hierarchies within the male portion and within the female portion in terms of and when we really think about kind of the evolutionary aspect of this, right? Of why power dynamics and hierarchies are forming in the first place, it's about access to resources in most other species. We'll kind of get into in a minute, like what makes humans so different. But most of the animal kingdom, like think about like Maslow's hierarchy, right? For those of you that don't know Maslow's hierarchy, the bottom rungs of Maslow's hierarchy are like physiological and safety needs. It's like I need to secure food, I need to secure water, and if I don't have food or water, that's going to highly influence my behavior. It's going to motivate me to secure those resources, right? And most of the animal kingdom spends like 95% of their time in those lower rungs of the hierarchy, securing food, securing water, securing safety. And so, because of that, there's a lot of stuff that happens in terms of forming hierarchies that's all about access to resources. And this is where dominance became such a big thing when we're thinking about power, is because oftentimes in these other animal species, dominance is a really good way of securing resources. Of like, I'm bigger than you, and so I'm going to eat more, and you can have some when I'm done.
Yeah, and for most, again, I go back to history. Most of human history has been people living in basically in extreme poverty. Most of our ancestors lived in what we would today consider extreme poverty, and it was just trying to meet those basic needs of food and shelter and health, I guess, to some extent. Um,
Totally.
and it wasn't until a couple hundred years ago when the kind of the industrial revolution and the enlightenment happened, and people or basically arose from poverty for the first time for a sustained period. So
Yeah.
now we're different. Now our power hierarchies are different, but it would stand to reason that before our great that the time of becoming much richer as a species, before that we were probably in just about the same situation as other social mammals.
Totally. And it's interesting because as we start to develop more stability around resources, we start to kind of be able to work up the hierarchy a little bit, right? And the next step up is really about kind of attraction, about belonging, about maintaining social groups and social cohesion and all of these kind of things. And that's a huge thing that drives our behavior, is like really wanting to be a part of something, whether that's your family unit, whether that's like a movement that you're really proud to be a part of. If I were to ask you who you are, if I just put the question up, who am I? You're probably going to list a bunch of relational descriptors. Like, if I were to answer that question, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a scientist. Like, all of those things, they represent my membership to a group. And because of that, that group membership is really important to me. And that becomes something that's a new resource, right? That is like having a pot of resources in terms of food and water and safety and all of that. But now that's something that I am going to strive for in terms of motivating my behavior in a different direction. And that starts to tweak a little bit the way that power dynamics then kind of play out in the human species, and still in kind of the higher primates too.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I guess we can. Do you want to spend some more time on the evolutionary angle to this, or should we jump into some of the biology and the interesting findings around status?
Yeah, no, we can definitely do that. And I think just to kind of give you a preview, Philip, you're talking about these things, these actions based on where someone is in the hierarchy. That's exactly where we're leading. So uh, these status hierarchies that pop up, and remember, these are spontaneous formations, right? There's a lot of cues that at the very beginning, you put a bunch of people in a room, there are things that we're automatically attuning to. And some of those are conserved through evolution in terms of dominance cues, in terms of how big someone is. A lot of it is eye gaze, right? So people that feel like they're high status subjectively, that feel like they have more power, more information, more dominance, whatever it is, are going to maintain a lot more eye contact. And those that feel more submissive subjectively are going to avert their gaze. And this is something you can do with dogs. Like, this is like staring a dog in the eyes actually signals like I'm the one in power right now. I'm the one in control. And you'll see that like there's this aversion of eye gaze or whatever that happens. And so now that we've kind of formed this hierarchy, what happens in terms of where you fall in that hierarchy to your health, to your brain, all of that? And that's kind of where we're leading.
And a lot of it is not so great when we're talking about low
Yeah.
status. It's associated, I mean, low status, which is something we should probably define. Like, what is it what does it mean to be low status? Um, and yeah, so maybe we should start off with that.
Low status would mean that you have less access to resources. So look at a troop of chimpanzees. You give them a bunch of food, and this is even like in a zoo, right? You give them a whole thing of food. The people highest in status are going to eat that food first, and then the next rung down is going to get the leftovers of that, and then the next rung down is going to get the leftovers of those two above them, right? And so they have the least access to food in terms of when they're allowed to eat. They also have the least access to mating. So the people higher in status are the ones that have the most access to mating with the females in terms of like a male dominated hierarchy.
Yeah, yeah, and it's just two things came to mind. There was a paper that we read in preparation for this episode that was just mentioned on that point that Genghis Khan is something like they may have misquoted this number, but they said like something like 1 in 200 people, men alive today, or people alive
I
today.
think it was people. Yeah.
And I don't know if that's in the world, but some ridiculous percentage of people in the world are descendants,
Yeah.
direct descendants of Genghis Khan. That kind of emphasizing that point about having more access to mating. Not to mention that he was a violent, kind of horrible person. But then also, on the other hand, when you were, or no, let's continue with this access to resources idea and what kind of health effects this leads to.
I mean, so first of all, I mean, you're gonna see malnutrition type stuff associated with that. Like the ones at the lowest rung of the hierarchy are gonna have kind of lower health markers in terms of nutrition, just in general, because they're not getting as much access to the resources in general. But the other thing that's really important to think about when you're low in status, when you're low on the hierarchy, is that you're constantly deferring to high status. So you're constantly like on edge trying to figure out like, am I allowed to do this? Am I not allowed to do this? Are they going to hit me if I do this? Are they going to punish me? Are they going to bite me? And that's what you see a lot of the time, is that uh, it's often called scapegoating. That like people that are higher, and this comes from like the pecking order thing that we were talking about. So the animals that are higher in the hierarchy will often take out their aggression on those lower on the hierarchy, and it's a way of like cementing their position within the hierarchy. And so they'll just like all of a sudden just start like hitting someone or hitting another ape or hitting another monkey that's just so happens to be lower in status, just to kind of show everybody like, yeah, I'm the one. And like they'll prevent them from eating food, and they'll attack them from doing that. And so all of this is talking about this within these like primate and monkey species, right? In terms of like there's a lot of stress associated with constantly trying to track these high status members and what the rules are and what they want and what they're going to allow me to do. And that can lead to incredibly high cortisol levels, and it can tear up your cardiovascular system.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So it's this psychological mediator of these health effects. These things like we see
Yeah.
cardiovascular problems, and um, again talking about in these primate species, especially monkeys and apes, but also has been observed in humans. Weakened immune systems, increased mortality rates, right? But keep in mind that this, I think when we start talking about status, it's tempting to just think that we're only talking about socioeconomic status, or that one's socioeconomic status perfectly correlates with everything we're talking about here. And as far as I understand, that is really not what the evidence shows in terms of low socioeconomic status, meaning that you're going to be, less happy and have lower mental health and things like that, because it's those the better correlation with those is absolute wealth rather than just your place in the socioeconomic hierarchy. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think that was why it was really important to really disentangle some of these ideas at the beginning, because what really stands out to me when you look at a lot of these health effects, especially as we start getting into like what happens to humans, because everything we've been talking about so far is like chimps hitting each other and biting each other. Like that's not what humans do. But we still have all of these really horrific statistics around what being lower in status does to our health. In terms of messing with our metabolic rates. There's higher obesity. There's higher rates of mental illness like depression and anxiety and all of these things. And what I really want to kind of step away from is that it's not, to me, the way that I really kind of look at this is that it's not status per se. It's being lower in power. It's not
Mm.
having control in your lives. We did a bunch of episodes a while back, like 6 months ago, about like learned helplessness. I got really into kind of the positive psychology stuff. And there's these really interesting studies by Martin Seligman that looked at how when you don't have control over your own suffering, that you tend to form depressive symptoms, you tend to form anxiety symptoms. And if you look at your life, so that's not about status, right? That's about the inner dynamics within your social relationships in your life, right? You're not constantly interacting with the alpha male chimp or whatever. You're interacting with your spouse, with your friends, with your family, with all of these people. And there are power dynamics at play. There are hierarchies, there are pecking orders within all of those small groups, because most of the groups that we spend time in are small groups. And those groups all have a certain level of competence hierarchy, a certain level of warmth hierarchy. And where you fall in that will dictate how much control you think you have over your life, right? If you're
Mm.
constantly doing things because your parents are telling you to, or because your spouse is telling you to, or because your friends are telling you to, you don't have as much control over the circumstances in your life as someone who is very like self-willed, that is like creatively doing things out of their own kind of intention and their own volition. uh, and there's health effects that show that doing that is very beneficial, of taking control and stepping out of those expectations.
Yeah, it's more about the perception of control over your life than than the objective situation a lot of times, because
Yeah.
people tend to when some stressful event happens, they can often go one of two ways: either believe that they have no control over it, or believe that they have control and try to take action. And as weird and woo as it sounds, the belief that you have control is often more important than how much control you actually have in determining what the sort of mental health effects will be of that stressor.
And this is really important because all of this stuff is changeable. This is like one of the big bases of like cognitive behavioral therapy and all of these things, is that you're reframing how you actually conceptualize a lot of these power dynamics. And one of the really important things about learning about this, about listening to an episode like this, is that you're gaining insight into the influence that these things have over you. Because everything that we've talked about so far is that these are unconscious processes. These are things that are driving us in one direction or another that we're oftentimes not reflecting on. And so we're feeling like we don't have control. But if we're able to stop and reflect and say, okay, I'm doing this because of this power dynamic in my relationship. How can I reconceptualize that? Do I really need that acceptance from that kind of person? Do I really need that whatever kind of resources they're promising me or holding over my head or whatever it may be? How can I like reestablish whatever kind of control I have in that situation and inform beliefs around what it is that I can do? And that really is what combats a lot of the learned helplessness, I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it seems like a lot of the time when you really ask yourself that question, whether you need to be sort of conforming to what the people around you, even people in your in group, kind of want you to do, the answer is no. Is that you are taking that as a kind of value in itself, to be valued by this group, and not really considering, what does that really mean for me? Is that really beneficial for me? But yeah.
Cool. So, I mean, some of the other things that we didn't mention, especially in humans, low status often turns to substance abuse. The less control that you think you have over your life, the more you start masking it and start distracting away with substances, with addictions in general. There's a lot that has to do with lower IQ. And that could have to do with just less access to resources, to information, to knowledge in general, because of where you fall in the socioeconomic ladder and all of that kind of stuff. This is very damning evidence. That this is something that needs to be at the forefront of people's minds. And if you really want to take control over your health, over physical health and mental health, gaining insight into how these power dynamics are affecting you in everyday life is really important. And so we're going to transition now into some of the biological stuff, and into kind of how our brain is processing some of these things. And then stick through to the end, because the end is when we're really going to break down what these different types of power actually are, and where the nuance is there in terms of how to spot one form of power over another.
Yeah. So maybe we should jump into testosterone, because that's
Hmm.
always one that is brought up in the context of power and status. And a lot of people think of testosterone as just the aggression hormone. They're like, the more testosterone you have, the more aggressive you are. But that's really not what the studies show. Instead, they show that testosterone is more about status, more about people. It's strange, because there's, at least how I understand it, there's these effects of where raising testosterone levels doesn't really change your disposition toward aggression. It just sort of amplifies it. So if you tend to be more aggressive, it'll make you even more aggressive. But if you're someone who tends to be more, passive, it's going to amplify that as well. But in terms of status, do you want to speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, there's. I think this is some of the most clever experimentation I've ever seen, because this is one of those hormones that has a lot of these like negative connotations associated with it. That there's been this, and especially like this cultural belief in our society that like testosterone is aggression. That the reason why men are super
Yeah.
aggressive and dominant is because of testosterone. And what they're seeing is that in those moments where aggression is needed to secure a power base, testosterone is correlated with aggression. But what they're seeing is that testosterone is actually associated with motivating behavior towards securing power bases, towards securing higher status. And so what they see is that when you win a dominance bout, when you win some type of status, when you win some type of power base, you have this huge boost in testosterone. But they did this really clever study with humans that they set up this whole scenario where obtaining status or obtaining power in the group that they were a part of required altruism, required cooperative behavior. And they actually saw increases in testosterone when you were engaging in altruistic cooperative behavior that was not aggressive or dominant, but just had to do with moving up in a status hierarchy, when moving and acquiring a power base. Because our brain knows that in order to survive, we need to secure these bases. We need to secure resources. We need to secure attraction and mates for protection, for stability, all of these kind of things. And so it makes sense to me, at least, that we have certain types of hormones and neurochemicals and all of these things that are influencing and pushing our behavior in one of those directions.
I think that's so interesting to think about how, like, humans and probably other higher primates, like, we're not just sort of instinctual creatures that are just, taking these cues of size and aggression as the way toward power or status. And we have a lot more nuance in how we think about and how we process what it means to be high status or high power.
And that gets into prestige, right? That like so much of what's going on maybe with testosterone and with all of these things in our society is really more about like seeing whether someone's competent, like obtaining competence, like showing that I have more skill, not more strength, not more aggression, but that I'm the person that people should be turning to in this situation, right?
Right. Right. Well, and as we're talking about testosterone, maybe this leads us into a little bit of the neuroscience, which is really scant, I guess. There's
New.
not, yeah, it's new. There is not all that much research on it, but there is some, and it overlaps with studies on status and hierarchy. And as we've been saying, so much of this is kind of automatic and happening unconsciously. With that caveat that we do not just take these really primal cues and only go with them. We have a lot more nuance in our understanding of what the hierarchies are. But there are some interesting findings on kind of the neuroimaging of powerful individuals.
Yeah, and it's something because it's spontaneous, because it's something that we believe to be highly conserved through evolution. Someone that goes into an experimental kind of mindset of trying to find these things in the brain is assuming that there's probably systems within our brain that are tracking this. Right? If this is so highly conserved across all of these species, then we should be able to find neural activity that somehow is indicating that our brain is keeping track of these things. And they've done a bit of this in the primatology research with macaque monkeys. They have like electrodes down in their brain and everything. And a lot of the work that's been done with monkeys has really been trying to understand like motivation. Oftentimes, I'm not a huge fan of the term reward. Reward gets thrown around so much. And to me, a lot of these systems that we call reward are really about motivation, about motivating behavior, about what is it that is beneficial in my environment that I need to move towards, or what is it in my environment that's threatening that I need to move away from. And that's what a lot of these systems that are like deep in the brain that involve dopamine are really highly tied to. And what you see with some of these systems, so the ventral striatum is one. In humans, we have the orbital frontal cortex that really tracks like value of, is this something that is important to me? And what we see is that we've seen increases in these areas that are tracking subjective value when monkeys are just viewing faces of high status individuals within their monkey troop. So you show them a face of a high status monkey, and then you show them a face of a low status monkey. You're going to get a lot more activity in the reward region or the motivational region when you show them the high status faces. And this has been replicated in humans too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think another way of thinking about these regions is, like you said, they're tracking value. They're tracking what's valuable to us. I mean, the ventral striatum and the orbital frontal cortex, these two regions that light up when monkeys and humans see high status faces, these are the same regions that light up when, you're making a choice between an orange and an apple, and you like apples more. These same regions are going to show greater activity in response to looking at the apple. So there's something about, value, like you're saying, motivation and value, like what getting us to sort of think about what's important to us. And these regions are kind of tracking that.
That was a good question from Philip. Is that the reason for our fascination with celebrities? That could be part of it, right? Because they've shown this in humans, that when we show pictures of high status, high competent people, that like it's this social comparison thing, right? We're looking up, right? We can socially compare up, and we can socially compare down, right? And when we see these people that have more than us, that are more competent, that have more resources, all of these kind of things, it's something that we want to attain. And so we look to them as a way of saying, like, can I hop on the bandwagon? Can I get some of those resources or some of that fame or whatever it is? That there could be systems in our brain that are automatically kind of tracking that kind of stuff. And there's monkeys that will forego food rewards. They won't even need a food reward just to look at a high status face. And they'll actually need extra food to look at a low status face.
That is so interesting.
Yeah.
And that kind of helps us understand why our attention just kind of automatically often orients to high status individuals, right? Because if they're seeming to represent a higher value to us, then it follows that our brains are going to be more attuned to focusing on, what are these people doing, who are they, and where are they.
This goes back to like one of the very first videos Andrew and I ever did together, looking at our goals, how we value things, and something to me that's like the most fascinating thing that the brain does is attention. And we are constantly receiving billions and billions of bits of information about what we're feeling and seeing and hearing and all of this kind of stuff, but we narrow all of that down to very salient information in our environment. And it's not something that oftentimes we're choosing to do, because there's reflexive attention. There's something that we just automatically look to things. And then there's controlled attention, which is a bit different. We have a whole episode on it. You can go back and watch it. But the reflexive attention part is something that tracks the things that we've established beliefs about as being valuable. So if we have this belief of where we are in a hierarchy, our attentional system is automatically tuned to look up and to look down at higher status versus lower status individuals.
Let's see.
That it seems like this part of the brain can be hacked due to admiration of high status people. Yeah, it's because it's based on belief. So if you put a bunch of work and a bunch of effort into saying, like, this is the person that I care about, this is the person that I want recognition from, that I want appreciation from, right? All of those social rewards that we want, our brain is automatically like, if they walk in the room, it's like, oh my God, there they are, like, right? Like we didn't like choose to do that.
And I love the example that Philip gave of the Elizabeth Holmes, the woman who is a fraud. What would you call her? Like a fake technologist. She claimed to have invented this medical device and was all over, had talks all over the place. And she dressed just like the founder of Apple, Steve Jobs. Yeah, and talked like him and looked like him. And I love that idea of the hacking these sort of status tracking systems in our brain by just like this superficial like imitation of what we consider someone who is like truly high status and probably deserves to be like Steve Jobs, and then sort of erroneously applying that to someone who just sort of acts and looks like him and doesn't actually have any of the qualities that we care about.
And attention is highly like intimately tied into memory too. So the things that we're paying a lot of attention to are also the things that we're going to remember the most. So in all of these studies that look at status, we tend to have a lot more memory for faces that we saw and everything that we saw that was high status, and a lot lower memory for the things that are low status. And this really leads into a lot of what status and power is actually doing to an individual, that will kind of lead into about whether it's corrupting us and those kind of things. And the one last thing I was going to say, like there's an area in the brain that tracks magnitude judgments. So
Mm-hmm.
if you have someone make a judgment about whether this weighs more than this, or whether there's more of these things than this thing, the interparietal sulcus, the IPS, will light up when you're making those types of math magnitude judgments. And they've done similar studies where they look at like people in the military, talking about whether someone's high rank or low rank or any, and that same region that tracks magnitude is also tracking rank, right? And so it just kind of shows, it's painting this picture that all of these systems in our brain that are tracking value, that are attuning our attention, that are laying down memory, that are making these judgments about whether something's bigger or less, all of those are involved in tracking these processes. Like this is a very like intricate, complex web of network that are all kind of working together to achieve these things.
Yeah, so it's like it's no coincidence that the person at the top of the hierarchy, we say they're number one or something like that. Um,
Right.
yeah. Although I guess that's a low number, right? So that's kind of weird. But anyway, so maybe we'll get into what is high power, someone with a high level or high self-perceived level of power. What does this kind of do to them? And this gets into the idea of like power corrupts, right? But
Yeah.
some of the most interesting studies, or some of the most prevalent studies, are on empathy and power, and that basically the finding is, although there are some contradictory findings, but mostly it seems like the research shows that power tends to lead to a lower ability to empathize with other people.
Yeah, and this is huge. Like, really take a moment to reflect on this. I mean, there's lots of different ways that they've looked at this, and there's different forms of empathy. We did a whole episode on empathy. There's like mirroring someone's actions, there's mirroring someone's emotions, there's mirroring someone's pain, and they've done studies across all of these different domains that show that if I consider subjectively that I have higher power than you, that I am going to respond less to your pain. I'm going to respond less in terms of imitating your actions. I'm going to respond less in imitating your emotions. And that really paints this interesting picture, right? That when we think about whether power is corrupting, it's whether or not it's causing the person that's in a high status, high power situation to start treating people differently, right? And this is showing that that could be the case, and it
Yeah.
leads to the idea of objectification.
Yeah. And it kind of, there's another like related finding that people with self-reported high levels of power also tend to think about problems in a more general or holistic way rather than thinking about the details. And I think that might have to do with this finding with lower empathy. And but it also reminds me of that surgeons will often talk about that they don't, well, I think I mentioned this in our episode on empathy, that they don't want to have empathy. They don't want to think about the person on the surgery table as being a person. They want to think of it as like, this is a job, like a very sophisticated mechanic, basically trying to like do this job that is really important, is going to save this person's life or make their life better in some way, but they have to kind of detach themselves from that. And I wonder if there's something going on with power too, where when you have this high power over other individuals, that sometimes that empathy can get in the way of making decisions that might actually be to their benefit. But obviously you can see how this would lead to like objectification and negative effects of having lower empathy, of just not caring
Yeah.
what happens to these people.
And that's, I mean, this is really important to consider, because if I'm and think about the low status individual, right? The low status individuals tend to be higher in empathy. And there's something to think about there, right? Because if I'm a low status individual, that means that I have to spend more time trying to think about what the high status individuals are thinking, what their intentions are, what their feelings are like. Because if they're angry, I don't want to do something wrong. And if they're happy, maybe that's a way of me getting in and getting more status or what, right? So, and when you're high status, you don't have to care about what the people below you think, about what their intentions are, what their feelings are, what their emotions are, because you're the one that has the resources. You're the one that can dole out punishments, that can dole out kind of recognition and appreciation and all of these kind of things. And so there's not as much of a need for it. I really want to. I haven't talked to Andrew yet, but I want to do an episode on leadership. And it would be fascinating to dive into this and to look at what makes a good leader in terms of like not objectifying people, realizing what power can do to you, that it can completely disconnect you from treating people like they're humans, from looking at them and seeing that they have their own lives, they have their own suffering, their own struggles. I mean, I saw this in terms of class when I lived in the Middle East, like looking at people that were high class, treating like servers, like they were dirt. It was really sad to see. Right. But it's something that, like, once you get into this position of actually feeling subjectively that you have more competence, more skill, more power than someone else, that you start to see them as less than. Um, and I mean, I'd watch our like episode on like in-group, out-group stuff and empathy because it all ties into the same thing.
That is, yeah, it's interesting though, because I recall from some of our research that when we were reading for this episode, that there is something about how high power individuals are, they may be using a different empathizing strategy. That there's some research that suggests that it's not that they're just lower in empathy, but that they're using what's called like a mentalizing or a cognitive empathy. So more just thinking about and reasoning through what somebody might be feeling, rather than actually like mirroring, having that actual empathic feeling of what that other person is emotionally experiencing.
And we got this question: how about the opposite? How do low status people view high status people? Is it a purely warm views? That depends, and that's a really good segue into what we're going to talk about. I think we're going to go a little bit over today. That's totally fine with me, because we haven't talked about the actual bases of power. And there's differences between like prestige and dominance, right? If I have prestige, and if you're looking at me with respect, if you respect my skills, if you respect my competence, there's going to be a very different view of me as a high status or a higher powered individual than someone who is constantly coercing you to do something, that's holding punishment and threat above your head. Those are not going to be warm views. I mean, I think everyone listening to this can relate to the crappy boss that they had in their past that they didn't view warmly, right? But there are people that you've had in your lives that have had power over you that you've still had a very warm relationship with. And that all comes into, I mean, that leads into, I love this comment from Kimmy about, yes, please do a leadership topic, because that ties into how it is that we actually use this power. What is it that we're doing to encourage people to move in one direction or another, and how is that maintaining the cohesion of the group as a whole?
Yeah, and there are these different bases of power, and so we're talking about, and it's, I didn't really realize how many there were, but I mean, we've, the one that we've mentioned a lot throughout this is coercive power, right? And I guess, would you agree that that would just entail basically the use of force or some kind of threat in order to secure power?
And I mean, so that's kind of the most overt way of using it, right? Of really like, that's where dominance really comes from. And when people think about power, they're often thinking about coercion. They're thinking about being threatened to do something, being forced to do something. But the more insidious forms of coercive power are actually holding things above your head in terms of taking things away, right? Holding punishments above you. Like, I'm not going to let you register. I'm going to fire you if you don't do this thing. Or I'm going to take this thing away. I'm going to take away your paycheck. I'm going to fire you, whatever. Those are all coercive forms of power. And what the literature shows is that using these coercive tactics is really bad for group cohesion. Like, when we're the whole question about, is it purely warm views? If I'm using coercive power, it's not going to be warm views from the people that I'm leading. And that's going to break down the cohesion in the group. And that's going to lead to me needing to use more coercive power in the future, because they're not going to do things because they respect me anymore. They're only doing things because they fear me.
Right, right. And I guess, yeah, so that's just a kind of a subtle caveat there that I think in maybe in like the political science literature, coercion or coercive power would be defined more as the use of force or violence or threats of force. But here we're defining a little more broadly to include also, the threat of, for example, being fired or something like that. Even though that's a sort of non violent interaction, it's
Yeah.
even voluntary, there's still this aspect of what we could call coercive.
And so the next one's reward power. And this is something any parent can relate to. This was a big part of being a parent in the past that I think we're kind of moving away from. But this is being able to give something to someone. And it can be something that's very tangible, right? I can give you a paycheck. I can give you a candy bar. I can give you something like valuable that you want, that's tangible, that I can hold. But it can also be intangible things. Like I can reward you with recognition, with appreciation, with ingratiation, right? Those are things that we as a human species really value. We want to be seen, we want to be accepted. And people can use that as a form of getting people to do what they want them to do. Carrots and sticks.
Right, right. And that's kind of like a lot of people would just draw it there, right? You're just coercive or rewarding, right? But then there's
Yeah.
these other bases of power, like expertise, right?
Yeah, and that's this is something that a lot of people, when they think about expert power, they immediately jump to like someone who has like a lot of schooling, that is like like me with my MS
Mhm.
next to my name down here, right? It'll be PhD soon, but it's something that people immediately jump to, thinking that like an expert has to be something that they've gained all of this expertise in something. But expert power plays out in everyday relationships. It's that I know more about the bills than you do. I know more about doing the chores than you do. It's expressing that I have more competence in some type of skill than you do, and so you need to defer to me for those kind of things. You need to follow my example because I'm the one that has the higher skill level.
Right. Yeah, and that's pretty clear, and that was kind of goes back to when we were talking about competence and talking about our kind of groups naturally forming sort of power hierarchies around expertise, but then moving through these bases of power, what is legitimate or legitimated power?
This one, and so I like to try to tie these back to people's everyday lives because on the kind of surface, what legitimate power is, when you look at how someone defines it, it's usually like an established authority figure, right? So you can think of a police officer, you can think of a judge, you think of a doctor, right? Someone who is in a position of power that we as a society have given them that position of power, and we accept that they're telling us what to do because we have given that to them. And this is something that societies are based off of. This is what holds societies together. This is a big problem in our society right now because we're starting to question legitimacy. We're starting to question whether or not those people or those institutions really should have the ability to tell us what to do, right? But legitimate power also plays out in our everyday lives too, in terms of this is really where respect lies. Like when I'm thinking about parenting with my child, I don't want to turn to coercive or reward power. I want to turn to legitimate power. I want my son to be doing what I want him to do because he respects the fact that I know these things. So, I mean, and these, one of the things to think about too is that there's a lot of mix and matching going on, right? That like the respect portion is that like I know that like you're the one that's in this position of authority, and like I give you that position of authority, but then you also have these flavors of expertise that are mixed in that. And the next one, which we're going to talk about, which is referent power. Uh,
Right.
so yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and because it is really important to remember that these get tangled up, and there's a lot of overlap, and so you can have different kind of bases of power, where, like you mentioned, the police officer. You see the police officer, and maybe that is a legitimate power is part of that. But then on the other hand, there's obviously a coercive aspect to that, that if you don't do what the police officer says, they're going to put you in jail or something, or maybe worse. But so it's not like one or the other, I guess, what we're saying.
And it's highly based on your belief, right? If you're someone who doesn't agree that police officers should have any authority, you're not going to see their type of power in the same light, right? And so all of this it's a group process. It's something that's mediated by the group itself, and whether or not we're giving them that power. This other one is referent power, and this one is by far, I think, one of the most powerful and one of the most like under the surface, under the radar types of power. Referent power is all about attraction. It's all about whether or not I want to be affiliated with this person. I want to be in a relationship with this person, right? It really defines the like I versus we, right? The we is so important to me. I want to be a part of this group. I want to be a part of the us, a part of the they, right? And that power can be really, really motivating for someone. We start to shed a lot of our individual values, our individual goals in place of the group's goals. And when I say group, I'm not just talking about like a big group, like a cultural movement or like left versus right or whatever. I'm talking about your relationships. Like I want to maintain my marriage. I want to maintain this spousal thing that I got, this partner relationship that I have going on. And because of that, I am going to do a lot of things that I otherwise wouldn't have done because I want to maintain that attraction and that cohesion. And this is one that can be really insidious, because if one person in a relationship recognizes that they have the referent power, then they stop. It becomes less of a two-way street at that point. They realize that you're doing everything because you don't want to lose them, and they don't put in a bunch of work because they realize that they have the referent power.
Yeah, and the extreme version of that being, manipulation and narcissistic kind of leading to gaslighting and things like that. But in the positive form, yeah, it can be a really positive base of power.
And this is what leaders take advantage of, is that they have a really good group message that they can rally people around. And they like, I want to be a part of this company. I want to be a part of this church, a part of this whatever, because of the values of the group. Right. And so I'll do a bunch of things that are group things just because I want that membership. I want that affiliation.
All right. And what's the last power base? The
scariest. Information power. And there's a reason I call it the scariest, and it's because oftentimes information power is not something that you can track back to the individual that's actually using the power. And this could be something that you're overtly like holding over someone's head. I have more information than you do. I mean, this is the basis of like so many like novels and popular shows. Like it was all the Game of Thrones stuff. It was all about like who could make the moves first. But the really insidious, the really scary part of this is all about misinformation. It's all about grapevine type stuff, about spreading messages through the gossip train, right? And turning people away from movements, away from other people, because you're just using the manipulation of information in general. And I think the reason I call this one the scariest is because we're on the verge of deep fakes. Which I think are one of the biggest existential threats to a society that could exist. And I don't know if everybody knows what a deep fake is, but
explain that for people.
Yeah, so we're at the point in history where we're seeing generative AI. AI can create videos that look like someone doing something. There's tons. You can look up the Tom Cruise deep fakes. You can look up the Obama deep fakes, where someone has gone and like given a speech and like done something, and then AI has completely modified their face to look like another person. And so now, if all of a sudden there's like video footage is what we have relied on as like the solid truth for so much of our current like modern society. Like this is, you bring it into a courtroom, like video footage is going to put someone in jail. Mm-hmm. But if now we can't trust where the information is coming from, what do we believe anymore? And this is something like with these misinformation trains and like these these like bots that will like put a bunch of information out. Like that's what all of this is about. It's about mass movement of behavior, because you're putting out something that they care about. That it's tying into a lot of these other bases of power. Right, information power is often used to manipulate the other bases of power. Right, if someone has really high affiliative needs, if they really want to be a part of a group, and now you have this information that's put out that may be false or whatever, that's threatening their group membership. Now they're going to do a bunch of stuff because of that referent power. So like all of this stuff is intimately tied in with one another.
Yeah, that's really important to remember, that it's not one thing, and that probably the most, successful uses of power make use of all six of bases of
Yep.
power.
And we as humans are drawn to obtaining these bases of power. That's really important to remember, that everything that we've talked about so far in this episode, in terms of how these hierarchies form, in terms of how our brain is tracking this information, what we're paying attention to, what we're remembering, what we're striving for, and what we're motivated towards in terms of valuation, and all of these things, is all about securing one of these bases of power. And the less bases of power that we have, the less control we feel like we have over our suffering, and the more depression and anxiety we feel in our lives.
Yeah. Well, on that note, looks like we're kind of reaching our time here, but
Yeah.
do you have any final thoughts you want to say?
I think that everyone should be very in tune with these processes. That the whole point of this episode, the whole point of the show really, is to give you all insight into how your brain works, into these psychological processes that are unfolding in your daily life. I teach a group dynamic class that's on my YouTube channel, and it's my favorite class to teach because it's so relevant to your daily life. And these things, if you don't really spend time reflecting on them, you're going to be at the will of them. And so that's my piece of unsolicited advice.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have just a couple comments here in the chat. Philip says, agree, quote, I was deep faked is about to become the new I was hacked. And that's, that may be the future. But yeah. And the last thing, I was going to say is just, I do think it's a little cliche to say, question authority, but there is an aspect of that I think is really important for everything we've talked about here, especially when we were talking about, Elizabeth Holmes and the ability to kind of fake high status in order to gain power, or those kinds of things. And also just, I think, questioning what is legitimate power, how much power should, say, the government have over your life, and being aware of how these processes actually work, I think, is important for understanding that and for forming your own, well-reasoned opinions about those kinds of issues politically and socially.
And I think because power is a group process, power is something that we give to individuals. It's not something that they take. And so you have to realize that we are the ones giving people power. If someone is using attraction and all of these things against us, it's because we're giving them that power. We're showing them that their relationship, whatever, means so much to us, right? And so once you realize how much personal power you have in those situations, it can do a lot to give you insight into these processes. So thank you all for tuning in. The chat was great and funny. I like it. And we just really appreciate people tuning in. We love doing this show. This is something that allows us to explore a lot of this in more depth than we would have otherwise, and to be able to share it. And so please, we want to do this for free as much as we can, but we're also working individuals in an inflated economy. And so any little bit helps to be able to keep the motivation up to help us do this. So cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll be back in probably 2 weeks with another episode. So we'll see you then.